What's up, everybody? Peter X Thistle Coffee here, and welcome to another episode of All Things Music. Been a minute since I've done these, and usually my goal in the All Things Music episodes is to look at music history or trends or current events. And so today I'm doing jam bands and party bands, and I think these are loosely thrown around terms, but they persist, and it's pretty interesting phenomenon. So let me do a quick definition. So jam bands are usually rooted in jazz, and are best known for their live shows. And the strengths of jam bands are great musicianship and solos, and we'll get into that. And I'll trace the history and the lineage of these bands, and you'll see where I'm coming from. The second category are party bands, and these bands are rooted in dancing and having a good time. And so the party bands are not as talked about as much, but there's a pretty rich history of party bands too. So you'll see where I'm talking about when I get into the examples. So the jam bands. Let's cut to the chase. The most famous jam bands would be the Grateful Dead and Phish. Honestly, I've not been to see either one. I have listened to a little bit of their studio work. Shakedown Street by the Grateful Dead, and I think A Touch of Grey was in the '80s. They had a top 40 hit off that. Neither band has seen much radio players, had much chart success. And I have listened, to some Grateful Dead and Phish concerts. It didn't do much for me, and so the saying goes is you gotta actually go and attend a concert to know what the deal is. So you have the Deadheads, and I think the Phish, are they Phish heads? I can't remember. Respect what they do, respect their fan base, loyal and rabid and whatever. But again, you have to be there. You have to attend to really get it. And since I haven't done that, I don't get it. But those are sort of the iconic jam bands. But that's not where it starts. For me, the first jam band is the Doors. And if you take a deep dive into the Doors, I mean, Robbie Krieger and John Densmore, are talking. They're Robbie more so than John, but they're doing the circuit. Rick Beato and the other YouTube music circuits, and the historians and whatnot. And the Doors were deeply rooted in jazz. They were jazz lovers. I mean, you hear Ray Manzarek play that organ, and there's a lot of jazz there. And they would go to the jazz clubs in the '60s in LA a lot, and so that comes through. That comes through in their live concerts. I mean, oftentimes, when they do the and their live shows, a 3 or 4 minute song in the studio becomes 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes. And of course, not only you have Robbie and his great guitar playing with flamenco, rooted in jazz, and Ray Manzarek, doing his jazz thing, tinkling the keys, but you also have Jim Morrison, in his poetry. So, you have the Doors and you have the Grateful Dead. And then, I mean, this is, people don't think about this as a jam band, but you have Parliament, Funkadelic, and George Clinton. And they started off, with that Funkadelic stuff. In the early '70s, they were a jam band, and they did everything, the funk and mixing it with rock and psychedelia. So, to me, those are the first big three: the Doors, the Grateful Dead, and P Funk. So, let's talk about party bands. Now, For me, the first great party band was the early Isley brothers. And if you go back and Hollywood has picked up on this, you go and you listen to movies set in the mid 60s and early 60s. You got the Isley Brothers Shout released in 1959 and Twist and Shout 1962. And the Beatles, I think, redid both of them, and they were staples of the early Beatles. You know, when the Beatles were in Hamburg, Germany, those were the staples of their live show where they really turned it out and hooked the audience because they were, this is pre-funk R&B. So it was a kind of a dance music back then. And so I put the Isley Brothers as that first party band. And for me, there's been plenty of party bands. I mean, Ohio Players. I mean, you got to really, the funk bands are the great, of the 70s are the great party bands. But the ultimate party band for me was The Time. It was, Prince in his 1999 tour took the time on the road. And I mean, Prince is Prince. You put a top 10 greatest, live act list, and Prince is on that list somewhere with Michael Jackson and James Brown and, the Rolling Stones and Kiss and whatever. Prince is on that list. And there were nights when, people said, the Time took the show from Prince, and this is Prince when he's breaking out, and Prince by 1999 Prince had his touring chops down, and his superpowers were in full effect, and the Time gave him a good run, and Purple Rain, the movie comes out, the tour's on, the Time is breaking up, but Prince was never going to take the Time out on the road with him for the Purple Rain tour. That was never happening, and maybe, Morris and other people, Morris Day saw that and was like, I'm not going out on the road, I'm out of here. But yeah, Prince was never going to take the Time. I mean, it certainly sharpened Prince's chops, but those dudes could throw down. There's plenty of Time concerts on YouTube if you wanted to check it out. I've been blessed to see the Time twice in concert, and those are some bad boys. So the genesis of this episode comes from the P-Funk tour, George Clinton and P-Funk from 2021 and 2022, and I saw them one of those years. I can't remember what year it was. I think it was the last time I actually wore a mask, so it was probably closer to 2022. It was in the summer, because this was inside. And what George kind of, George is in his 80s now, and he knows he's not going to be around forever. And one of the strengths of a party band is, it can be decentralized. I mean, George is a hugely charismatic figure. I mean, you go to a P-Funk concert, chanting George's name, he just lights up a stage. But P-Funk can serve, George was trying and is still, I think, is trying quietly to set up a scenario where P-Funk lives on when he's gone. And to teach, this tour is almost, that tour is almost teaching them, what a jam band is. And that's why, I got the idea out of that. So George in that concert, I saw him in Indianapolis. He came to Butler, Clues Hall. He had a rap act. And George rarely has opening acts because, I mean, he can play for 3.5 hours. And he got close to that again on this act, even though he's in his 80s. But he had a rap act. But what set this apart is he brought 2 acts on as an opening act. One was called Pimps of Joytime, and they were a party band. And this is kind of where I got this separation. They were good. It impressed me. They're out of New York City via Brooklyn, have roots in New Orleans and San Francisco. And then he brought out a local group out of Bloomington called Dizgo, Dizgo, and they were a died in a wool jam band, and both of them were very good, and they did it differently. The one thing that they both had was they both had very good lead guitarists. So that that was the what they shared. Um, so going back to George and his branding, I mean he's trying to brand P Funk into a jam band because I mean, he wants P Funk to survive. And one of the things George has done, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, is he's brought his family into it, his grandkids and his kids. Now he's also bringing some of the members, the other members, original members, or the 70s members of P Funk, and bringing their children who are musicians into the band. And so George is always, I mean, George is controversial, as far as, I mean, folks, P Funk folks, bailed on George in the late 70s. The drugs and everything, and P Funk just kind of died out because of the partying atmosphere and just the pace that they were constantly touring in the 70s. And George has constantly toured for most of his life because, he did not own the rights to his catalog. So if he wanted, to make money, he had to tour. And he got better with bandmates, and took them along so they could get paid as well. So George is just been a workhorse live, and has turned P Funk into one of the great jam bands of all time. Now the interesting thing, going into P Funk is that you know when George is on the road, he's more of a jam band, and Bootsy can be a jam band, but Bootsy and George lets Bootsy, play whatever P Funk songs he wants. Now, the interesting thing is, I ran across late in the last month or so where P Funk played "I'd Rather Be With You" by Bootsy. So that's the first time, you know, I've heard P Funk or George play a Bootsy song, and they met up in the early '70s. Bootsy was the bass, and some of that Funkadelic and early Parliament stuff, and then Bootsy broke off and did his own thing. So, the Bootsy George, collaboration. They were on. George got Bootsy, and it was part of the P Funk family. Got them the record deal, and so interesting how all that. Works out. But Bootsy can be a jam band at time and concert. But I always say George can turn a 4 minute song into 20 minutes, and Bootsy can turn a 4 minute song into 2 minutes. And so Bootsy, wisely I think took a different turn, but is flexible enough where he can be a jam band as well. As, that's in the P Funk sort of DNA. Rick James is interesting as I talk about, folks leaving P Funk and, kind of falling apart, legal troubles, drugs. So I think, George lost the rights to Parliament and Funkadelic name again, and that's why he went into using his name as George Clinton with the same people. Um, but Rick James opened for them, and I think the '79 tour, 78, '79, and basically stole the show from him. Now Rick is interesting because if you listen to Rick's studio music, he should be a party band because that he does party music. But Rick has always tried, for whatever reason, to do be a jazz jam band, and with, in my opinion, mixed success. I mean, Rick is still good live, but he would have been a lot better shortening his songs and just leaning into the power of the funk and the dance and just be a party band. But it is what it is. Rick James is still a legend, still one of my all time favorites. Still love him. I'm a Prince guy, and Rick and hates Prince, but hey, that ain't about me. Um, and briefly also on where the other place where party bands live is most big cities have R&B cover bands, and they play a lot of funk, and those are party bands. In Indianapolis, I mean, Toy Factory's our big party band, cover band. And then, some of those party band cover bands are really, really good, just like some of the classic rock cover bands are really, really good. So just because they're not writing their own music, don't diss these folks because they can, someone can really, really, really put on a good show. And that's the case in Indianapolis for Toy Factory. So going back to that 2021 2022 P Funk show I saw with the opening acts. One of the things that was pretty cool is, well, we were having dinner before the show, and two guys were sitting next to us, having dinner right next to the venue, and you know they ended up being Pimps of Joytime, the drummer and the percussionist in the band. And afterwards, they came out in front and talked to, the fans along with Disco. Disco I've seen three times, other times. I actually missed Dizgo on that. Because we were eating dinner and we're like, oh, they're opening acts, whatever. They're not any good. And so I was like, I saw the program. I was like, well, let me check out Disco. And I went and on YouTube and found Dizgo, and Disco was amazing. And they're out of Bloomington. They come through about twice a year. They came through Indianapolis, so I saw them a couple times at the Vogue in Indianapolis and Broad Ripple. And so they always chat, before and after concerts, and I've talked with them a couple times, emailed with Dizgo. I mean, those guys are good, and they're touring the country for whatever reason. I saw just yesterday they're going to the Caribbean and doing a concert down there sometime in the next few months, and so that'll be great for them. At some point, I don't know why they haven't hit California yet, but they're going to hit California, and I think California is going to fall in love with Disco, and I think they're going to really go big. One of the things I love about Disco is, they throw in one cover song every single concert. And it's interesting because they have a way of making it their own, but still, you know, you know, paying homage to the tribute. And they have an amazing concert where they play tribute to Pink Floyd that is just amazing. It's really, it's half Disco and it's half Pink Floyd, and they have a way of doing that, of sort of melding the DNA, and it's really good. That's not on YouTube, but they have another platform where they upload music, where the lovers of jam band music go for that stuff. So, check out Disco on YouTube, and if you like them, go to their website and they'll tell you where to find that Pink Floyd concert. They, they I think it was 2018 or 2019. They played Indianapolis, probably the Vogue again, on Valentine's Day, and they open up the set with "Give It to Me, Baby" by Rick James, and that's just, it's half Rick and half Disco, and it just works. And so they did Electric Avenue by Eddie Grant when I was there for one concert, and I can't remember. Nobody knew that. I mean, they were mostly, they're younger. They're probably millennials or young millennials, or maybe older Gen Z. They're probably young millennials, and most of the folks who see them are Gen Z or millennials, and they probably had no idea what Electric Avenue was. But the fact that Disco knew that song and they killed it was amazing. The other, one other thought on the Pimps of Joytime, I was talking about meeting the drummer, and then after that concert, got to talk with the the lead singer too. What I liked about Pimps and Joytime is interesting. Was I was like, what caught me in that concert was, I talk about the fat bass funk and adding the SH-101 and those fat synth basses in the late '70s. So the Pimps of Joytime in that P Funk concert, they had a drum machine and a real drummer and a percussionist, and it just drove that music. It was really, really funky. A lot of people don't know this, but James Brown would often go on to use two drummers live, and she got that consistency with a drum machine and that drive that you can get with a drum machine. So, I was pretty impressed with the Pimps of Joytime thinking about that, and all that syncopation and funk was, it was filthy. So, shout out to Pimps of Joytime. Shout out, I think I've met all the members of Dizgo for the most part. Because they're always there to talk after their concerts or before the concerts, and amazing musicians. Great lead singer. They got two singers. Great keyboardist. So yeah, check those two out. So, but the end, we got to jam bands and party bands. I mean Prince, and in the late, I think it was '87, Prince did his first after show, and then the bootleg came out in the early '90s, and everybody lost their mind, and that started being a staple when Prince would go out, not all the time, but Prince would oftentimes go to a city and he'd do his normal concert, and then go to a venue nearby in the city or just outside the city at a small club and do an after show. And so Prince, his concerts were very structured and party band style, and his after shows were jam band sessions and very jazzy. Prince in the early 2000s released a a live album called One Night Alone, and there were a couple of additions to that. And one of them is an after show, and that's the only official after show he's ever released, as part of the canon. I can't remember what that's called, but it's connected to the One Night Alone live. So check that out. That and seeing how Prince, and there's plenty of Prince after shows. I mean, and oftentimes, later in his career when he was playing First Avenue, those First Avenue shows would end up being jam bands sometimes. Not I would say the post Love Sexy era. Oftentimes those First Avenue shows would wander into the jam bands thing. So yeah, so just had to give Prince his props as playing in the sand with jam band and the party band. The if I have to also say another quintessential party band would be the Revolution, because the Revolution was very funky and a very good party band, despite having to go up against the time. Um, on the 1999 tour. I mean, Prince, did, I mean, the time is pure funk, and, Prince did all types of genres. So, you got to give, the Revolution props for, because they had to learn a little bigger palette than the time did. So, in their own, folks in the Prince, a universe of love are still arguing over, who is better, the time or the revolution. I'm like, they're different things. Love them both. So anyway, on that note, I'm gonna get out of here. I got some more of these types of episodes coming up. So looking forward to diving into the history again. So thank you again for coming through. Again, my name is Peter Exodus O'Coffer. Got two novels and novella on Amazon under the name Peter Exodus O'Coffer. Got 6 albums, I believe, under Exodus, Xodus, on all the streaming services. First album's called Book One. Quick way, I got 2 albums, titled The 317 Volume 1 and 2. So check me out and let me know what you think. Leave some comments on this episode. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And thank you again for coming through, and I will see you next episode.